Right. Okay. Once again, good afternoon, everyone. It is now 3:34. I'm Paul Krikorian, the chair of the Education and Neighborhoods Committee. Councilmember Zine is here in chambers, and we are ready to proceed with the committee meeting of January 26th. And if the clerk is with us, we can proceed with item number 1.
Item number 1 is a city clerk report relative to the 2010 neighborhood council elections and the feasibility of including the newly certified Westwood Neighborhood Council in the city clerk's upcoming 2010 neighborhood election cycle, and on a process by which new certified neighborhood councils will be included in the city clerk's neighborhood elections process, scheduled pursuant to council action of January 22nd, 2010.
Good afternoon.
Madam Clerk, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Krikorian. Mr. Zine. So as not to saddle the committee with a great number of extraneous information, which we all know what the problem is. The city clerk has a, by law, specified time period with which to run neighborhood council elections. And as is what happens in real life, neighborhood councils get born all the time. And this particular one got born just on the cusp of our entering active election mode. We put our heads together. We thought, we dreamed, we shook up the system. We consulted with our colleagues in the city attorney and different council offices, and we believe we have a reasonable solution. The reasonable solution is this. We have tried to adhere to the spirit of what neighborhood councils are all about by working in a long length of period, back and forth buy-in period, so that each neighborhood council would get a election experience that was unique and personalized and tailored to them. If the council chooses, if this committee chooses and the council chooses, we can offer the option of offering what we call an abbreviated election for the Westwood Neighborhood Council. We would still use their bylaws, and in those areas where their bylaws are silent or incomplete on certain election criteria, then we fall back, as we would for any neighborhood council, to what we call our default neighborhood council criteria. This, if approved, this would produce a very quick process, or a much quicker process, a more flexible process, and we believe we could do it at no additional cost. So therefore, what is before you are two alternative options. One would be to request our office to proceed with conducting the Westwood Neighborhood Council Board election in the abbreviated fashion as described in our report, which we submitted earlier today, using the Westwood Neighborhood Council's bylaws, which on file done as of February 5th. And the reason why we put a cutoff date is it is an arbitrary cutoff date, but we know that bylaws change all the time, and it would just be we would be chasing our tails to adjust our election every time the bylaws change. So whatever the bylaws are as of February 5th, that's what we're going to use. And then we would apply the city clerk's election procedures and default values where in any areas where the bylaws are either silent or inconsistent. We would also seek to obtain a letter of agreement from the Westwood Neighborhood Council's initial board so that there is a clear and transparent understanding of what our duties are and what's going on. And as I said before, no additional cost would be required. The other option that could be considered is that we could go through a outside vendor. In that case, you would authorize us to develop and release a request for proposal for an independent election administrator. You would allow us to select and contract with that vendor. That vendor would then conduct a neighborhood council election for the Westwood Neighborhood Council. And it would pretty much be up to you to define if you want that election experience conducted by the IEA to be abbreviated or customized. And We do not know the costs at this point until such time as the RFP goes out and we get bids coming back that say, I'll do it for this price, I'll do it for that price. And the last provision of that recommendation would be that, as we do not have the funds for that, that your committee make a recommendation where the funds would come from to pay for the independent election administrator. This is the Westwood portion of the report. I'll stop at this point for any questions of me or my staff before we approach the other half, which is any other new neighborhood councils in the future.
Councilmember Zine, any questions relating to Westwood?
Vendors, what type of folks would be involved in running elections?
I'm sorry.
You said outside vendors to run elections. What kind of organizations would be involved in that?
If I'm not mistaken, Dunn used independent election administrators in their 2007 or 2008 election.
In the past, the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment has used individuals or organizations who participated as the independent election administrators.
And what qualifies them for that?
At that point, I believe it was Dunn that had a training for them, but they'd be able to answer that better.
Wait, so Dunn trained them, and then they, under contract, did the elections?
Correct.
So why didn't Dunn just do it?
Which portion?
The elections. I mean, Dunn, you find people, you train them, you pay them, I assume, they do the elections.
Correct.
Why wouldn't Dunn do that with whatever resources they could get under contract and not farm it out to someone? I'm curious as what kind of organization would do an election.
Dexter, City Attorney's Office. The City Council had voted to adopt election procedures, and the City Council decided they wanted to have an independent election administrator to do the elections. In my opinion, in part because some of the criticism that the department had received prior to that when they were trying to assist the neighbor councils with the elections, so this was sort of a compromise.
Yeah, but I'm trying to find out where do you get these individuals that run these elections that are paid?
In the past, they volunteered to participate, such as Jerry Kavasnica, who used to be with the League of Women Voters. You also had Stephen Box, who is a community organizer involved with neighborhood councils.
So you didn't get an organization that was credentialed, licensed, you just got individuals that assumed that role?
Again, this was when the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment performed the elections, correct?
Okay.
Peter King, City Attorney's Office. I was there back then, and essentially they used the League of Women Voters previously. They used this Jerry Kavasnica. They used others that had some experience with it, and the reason that they did so is because they didn't have enough staff to do it themselves at the time.
Do we have the cost, what that cost to do?
Previously, we've seen some of the contracts that were used, and they range. They began with a flat rate of $1,200 per election, and they ranged to about $3,500 per election, depending on the selection of election-related activities that the neighborhood council selected.
So that could be up to $90,000+ if we use that formula with 90 neighborhood councils.
Correct, but that did not incorporate the cost associated with the department at that point printing out ballots, developing supplies, providing those supplies to the independent election administrator. The independent election administrator was only charged with actually meeting with the neighborhood council, developing the election procedures, and then on the day of being there so that the process ran smoothly.
And it was run by some of the folks from the neighborhood councils in that particular community.
Correct. In some cases, the volunteers on the part of the neighborhood council would show up, but in conversation with the independent election administrators for the city clerk taking over, we did hear that in some cases the independent election administrator was the only person that would show up on election day. So that was sometimes an issue.
What about the voters?
The voters would show up, obviously.
I'd hope so. Because we have community groups. We have Sherman Oaks Homeowners Association, Woodland Hills Homeowners Association. Do we know how they run their elections? Tarzana Property Owner Association, do we know how they run their elections? Have we ever looked into, we don't seem to hear controversy about it. Have we ever explored to see how they run those elections, which don't generate any controversy?
We have not explored that. No.
Maybe we should, to see how they run their elections, which don't generate controversy or arguments or hostility in communities. I know in my community I've got Tarzana Neighborhood Council, Tarzana Property Owners Association, they work well together. Woodland Hills Homeowners Organization, they run their elections. I don't know exactly the process, but they don't seem to have controversy or the battles that seem to take place that we hear about.
Arlene Taylor, City Clerk Election Division. Oops, sorry. My understanding is there was a good mix of interested parties in the working group that developed the first set of standardized election procedures that were put together in 2005, and when it was approved, not approved.
They were approved, yes. There was a working group comprised of members of my office, neighborhood councils, city staff, and came up with a system that the city council apparently at the time thought would be a nice process, a good, fair, and transparent process to conduct the elections until they were transferred over to the city clerk.
Right. And one, I'm assuming that the neighborhood council stakeholders brought their experiences with them, and many of them are involved in homeowners associations and such. And also, when we developed our election procedures, we based it off of those standardized, approved procedures.
Yet the charter decided that the neighborhood councils wouldn't be cookie cutter. They'd all be different and distinct for the communities. And one thing that we've discussed this about the city budget, where we're looking at major changes in expenditures, and every time I look at a dollar out, I look at who's going to lose their job over that dollar out. So the cost factor, and that's why I'm inquiring about the process and what it's costing. I know $1.9 million, which we discussed last time we had the meeting, was extremely costly for what we're trying to accomplish in these economic times. It's not a secret that we're now talking about 1,000 additional city employees losing their jobs, getting pink slips, which is a huge hit. And if we're spending money on these and people losing their jobs to provide other services, we really have to analyze that, yet do it in a manner that's not going to cost us significant amounts of money. So I'm going to keep coming back to the money aspect. Thank you.
And in light of that money aspect, for purposes of the election process for the, if you will, belatedly certified Westwood Neighborhood Council, what's before us then is a recommendation for conducting that election through under the administration of the city clerk within existing resources with no additional expenditure by either the city or by the neighborhood council, or and with that option, the neighborhood council would be losing some of the individualized flexibility that might otherwise have been available had they been able to work with the city clerk over the course of months as others have. Right. But in the alternative, if the neighborhood council, or if we were to opt to give the neighborhood council that greater degree of flexibility, then we would need to find another avenue through an independent election administrator that would require some additional cost. We're not quite certain what that cost would be. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Okay.
That's a fair summary, assuming you want to go with the election process, because I, again, want to remind you that the charter does allow for the selection process, which the neighbor council had put into their bylaws to accommodate the fact that they understood that the city clerk might not be able to do the election.
Right. The charge from the council to the clerk to report to this committee, though, was to find was to report on how that could be done. Correct. And so within the parameters of what the council's charge to us was, those seem to be the options that are before us. Is that right? Okay. So under the clerk-administered scenario, when would we be able to proceed with a Westwood Neighborhood Council election? What phase would that fit into?
Basically, as soon as the item is approved by full council, we would go into active election mode. At some point, we would pursue and secure the letter of agreement from the initial board, but it is not a sequential thing. As soon as council adopts your recommendation, we would go forward in full election mode. Am I correct?
Okay. All right. Well, then, I know we have another part of this agenda item to discuss, which is how do we deal with any additional neighborhood councils that might be certified at some point in the future, and having a broader policy. But for now, well, actually, let's see what public comment there is on this item, whether that whether the Westwood portion or the larger policy portion on item 1. Why don't we proceed to public comment now, and then we'll come back to take action on that. So on item number 1, I have 3 cards. The first is from Jan Williams. Come on up.
No, you need to come to the microphone. You need to be on the record.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Williams, welcome.
I'm Jan Williams, and I'm part of the formation group that appeared before Bonk on January 19th when the Westwood Neighborhood Council was certified. And I want to thank you for considering making Westwood Neighborhood Council part of the upcoming Neighborhood Council elections. It has always been our first desire as part of the formation group to have an open, city clerk run election for the Neighborhood Council. And we expressed that priority at the Bonk hearing. We want to make sure that in everything that I've heard today, what I don't understand is the actual schedule, because we have a lot of outreach to do, and we want to be sure to do as thorough a job as we can, and would prefer to, if the process is, until June, to be in June, so that we can make outreach to the groups that we want to make it as inclusive as possible. So I would like to understand what the schedule would be if this is, if this goes forward. We're also interested in finding out when and how an election would be held, part because questions are coming in from the community about the election. We want to be sure we can answer those questions, and also requests from the community to submit names for council seats, and we want to know how to handle those as well. So those are my questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Our next speaker is Caroline Spencer. Ms. Spencer, welcome.
Due to the rain, we just arrived, so I didn't hear all of your conversation. But what I want to say is my name is Caroline Spencer. I live in the southeast corner of the Westwood neighborhood. I'm here speaking to you on behalf of many of Westwood's neighborhoods, community stakeholders. The Westwood area needs a fair democratic election. Westwood stakeholders deserve the same quality election administered by the city clerk, which is also being provided to the other 89 neighborhood councils. Anything less than a city clerk election is unacceptable to our council member Paul Koretz, the tens of thousands of Westwood stakeholders who expect and deserve a fair election, and it should be unacceptable to you as members of the city council. An election administered by an independent election administrator is patently unacceptable. Previously, when elections were overseen by Dunn, they were administered by these IEAs. These elections were often fraught with controversy. It is one of the main reasons why the City Council transferred responsibility for administering neighborhood councils from Dunn to the City Clerk. Considering all of the controversy surrounding the Westwood formation application, it is essential that the election for the initial board for the Westwood Neighborhood Council be above reproach. I thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Prudence Factson. Ms. Factson, welcome.
Good afternoon. My name's Prudence Factson. My family bought our home in Westwood in 1943. I've been involved in the community, and I'm on the interim steering committee with Jan, and I very much support what she has to say. Sorry to put on reading glasses, but I wanted to let you know that we have 116,000 stakeholders in our area, so our area is quite large. We were certified last week. We'd like some time to get together and to reach out to our population, make sure that as many people as possible are involved. So we would prefer that we had an election a bit later on, let's say in June, because we're going to have to hold public meetings, and we're going to have to reach out to students in the community, to a variety of people. And we've just been certified. So I'd like to, we're happy to do whatever you'd like to do, whichever way you want to hold the election is fine with us. I'm here just to let you know that we've worked very hard to get this far. And we want to make sure that it's very democratic and that as many people as possible are involved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And the final card that I have on this matter as of now is for Wolfgang Vieth.
Yes.
Mr. Vieth, welcome.
My name is Wolfgang Veit. I've been living in the Westwood area in the North Village for over 30 years. I've been a renter ever since. I have fought for renters' rights since 1985. There's about 15,000 renters in our immediate neighborhood in the North Village. And we went through this formation process last year, which has been extremely controversial. So has the certification process. There was at least as much opposition to the neighborhood council formation than there was for the formation. As a matter of fact, there were 3,000 signatures presented at the certification hearing that objected to that neighborhood council. In that, with that background, we demand that we get a very fair and equal election, and that has to be done by the city clerk. There was a talk already about independent election administrators. We totally object to that because that would be not neutral, that would be not equal to our concerns. And if money is the issue, we figured it could come out of the neighborhood council budget, either from decertified neighborhood councils that are going to be decertified, or even from the new Westwood neighborhood council, because the city clerk only takes about $25,000 per neighborhood council in election cost. So it's feasible. And we demand that the city clerk, if an election is held, it has to be by the city clerk. Thank you.
Thank you. Just for a little bit of, no, it's okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you. For a little bit of clarification, because I think there's been a consistent theme, this election will not be precisely the same as the other neighborhood council elections that would be administered by the clerk because of the lateness of the day and because the certification happened after the deadline that was set forth by the clerk. So there is going to be less flexibility than there would be in another neighborhood council election where the neighborhood council would have the opportunity to work with the clerk to meet its own unique needs. And but I'm presuming from what I'm hearing from the speakers today that as long as it's administered by the clerk, consistent with the bylaws that the neighborhood council set forth, that's okay, as long as it's administered by the clerk rather than the IEA. Is there any disagreement with that assumption that I'm making? Well, what I mean is, and I'm sorry that you missed this discussion at the outset, but the clerk has worked for many months in preparing for these elections with the previously certified neighborhood councils to try to create elections that were both uniform in their administration, but also took into account the unique nature of the bylaws of each of the 89 neighborhood councils and so forth. Because Westwood is being certified so late in the process, the clerk's proposal was to have an election administered by the clerk within current resources of the clerk, but without the ability to create new procedures that would be unique to Westwood. An election consistent with the bylaws, but without the ability to add on a lot of new and unique features, as might have been the case had we started on this process 6 months or so ago. So with that proviso, I'd like to see if Dunn has any comments on what we've talked about, the administration of this. And then if I could ask the clerk to come up just briefly. There was some talk about the timing of this. They will need additional time for outreach. Can you please talk a little bit about when you would be prepared to go forth with this election? There was mention of a June time frame. Would that be consistent with what you would be proposing as well?
It is our anticipation to blend blend Westwood Neighborhood Council's election with the last of our regions that are up for election. That election will be taking place on June 26th. And is that good? I'm glad. And Arlene, you could give a couple of the other key dates, such as candidate filing, and just a few of the key dates in the timetable.
Okay. Let me just add that if you go to our website and look at Region
Speak into the microphone, please. I
Region
know it's
H.
rude to have your back to
Yeah.
who you're speaking to, but if you could speak into the mic, that'd be great.
So let me go through some of the dates. And as I was saying, these are available on our website under Region H, which is the region that was drawn. I mean, it's obviously that's the 8th region, but Region H is the one that will have its election last. And as the city clerk mentioned, it is scheduled for Saturday, June the 26th, which means candidate filing, which begins 90 days prior to the election day, will begin Tuesday, March 30th, and end Tuesday, April 27th. After that period, there will be a 29-day period in which write-in candidates can qualify. I'm sorry. Okay, well, I'll just ignore it. So there is a write-in candidate filing process built into our standard election procedures, and that will begin April 28th and end May 27th. I think those are the major dates. But again, let me refer you to our webpage, Region H.
I'd like to make a couple of comments also. By no means does this mean that the clerk is going to barge through and conduct an election without even talking to the Westwood Neighborhood Council folks. That is absolutely not our intention at all. We do want to engage them in dialogue. We will be in communication with them. The one proviso is exactly as you said. There will be less opportunity for ultra individualization of procedures that but it is not our intent to ram anything down anybody's throat. We do invite, when we look forward to a positive dialogue with the Westwood Neighborhood Council. And whatever customization or individualization that will be missed can be made up for in 2 years hence when they're up for re-election in 2012.
Right. One important item that we did put in our report is that they will be limited to one ballot type, which will be voted on by all stakeholders. So, for example, many of the NCs, the neighborhood councils, have multiple ballot types, some of them 20, 30, wherein, homeowners are the only ones allowed to vote for homeowner representatives or business owners for the business owner representatives. In order to do this as quickly as possible, although the candidates can be qualified on an individual basis in terms of their stakeholder status, it would have to just have everyone voting on every office and everybody on the same ballot. That's one of the compromises, and that'll enable us to get this done in time.
Okay. Thank you. Well, it appears to me that there's a remarkable consensus developing here. So that being the case, I'd like to move that we approve a recommendation for conducting a neighborhood council board election for the Westwood Neighborhood Council and request that the clerk proceed with the conduct of the neighborhood council board election as described in the clerk's report of January 26th, 2010, according to the Westwood Neighborhood Council's bylaws on file with the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment as of February 5th, 2010, and by applying the city clerk's election procedures and any city clerk default values where the bylaws are either silent or inconsistent, and obtain a letter of agreement from the Westwood Neighborhood Council's initial board, and with the assumption that no additional costs will be required.
Second that.
Okay, that will be the recommendation of this committee then to the council. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, the second part of our of that agenda item is the clerk's recommendations for how we can deal with similar situations going forward. What should be the process for late certified neighborhood councils? The council asked for that recommendation as well, and I think it's it's probably early to have a full recommendation on that, but I'd like to invite you to offer any comments you might have on that.
I'll be glad to touch on the major options that we can put forward to the committee for their consideration. The first option for neighborhood councils newly certified after June 2009 is, well, actually, this is sort of an ancillary point. We would be able, since we have accommodated Westwood Neighborhood Council, we would say that we will take anybody else that certifies up to Friday. That's option one, right? Anybody else up to Friday, using this same technique that we're doing for Westwood. So that's an ancillary point, but it is an option.
How many are in the pipeline?
Bangwan has that information.
That was actually one of my questions for Mr. Kim. Is the department aware of any other neighborhood councils that are pending certification right now or anticipate being certified within the next few months?
We currently have an application in from Northridge South, so that should be going to the commission for recommendation, and within 2 or 3 months there are about 3 groups that are in various stages of formation. So those could come sooner, but they could also come later.
So Northridge South, the timing would be?
Probably 2 months to the commission.
Is there a limit how many we can have in the city of Los Angeles?
There is no policy that I'm aware of that limits, no.
So we could have 1,000?
Other than the geographic coverage. So there aren't that many areas of the city that are not represented that haven't already spoken that they don't want a neighborhood council.
Okay. Yeah. So there's not many more that would be coming after. They'll trickle through then.
It'll trickle through, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, another option that we can put forward for your consideration is the one that our city attorney staff, Gwen Poindexter, pointed out to you, is that the neighborhood council may autonomously establish their first board. They have the ability to include a process in their bylaws to establish a selection committee, and those members' tenure would end with the next city clerk run election. And I should point out that this has always been available to neighborhood councils, and actually there are some neighborhood councils such as Wilmington and Bel Air, Beverly Crest, who do fill the majority of their board seats using this system. The last alternative that is up for discussion is the one that's a little bit more complex, and this is mindful of the fact that the city law currently states that neighborhood council elections, whether the clerk runs them or the clerk delegates it to an independent election administrator to run, must take place in even-numbered years in the months of March through June. So if there are other neighborhood councils that become certified and you wish to be able to accommodate them, we would recommend the independent election administrator route. So that would have to happen. And the second thing that would have to happen is that the council would have to adopt a modifying ordinance that changes the current March through June even-numbered year timetable. The last thing the committee would need to do is similar to the option that we offered for Westwood for the independent vendor route. Council would have to select where the funding is going to come from. And the reason why we would have to farm it out to an IEA is because the clerk will be busy running municipal elections for those other times.
Well, given the fact that did you want to add something? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Given the fact that other than this one Northridge South that's already in the pipeline, it doesn't sound like there's a lot that's imminent. I think we can defer further action on this until a future meeting of this committee without a recommendation to the council at this point, unless there's anything further that anyone wants to add to the contrary. Okay.
We would be glad to come back to the committee at a future date and discuss this further.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your cooperation in this under a very short time fuse.
Our
I
pleasure.
appreciate it very
Thank
much.
you.
All right, thank you very much. That brings us to item 2 on the agenda.
Item 2 is a motion, Krikorian Han, relative to the City Controller's audit findings on the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, addressing issues of concern regarding fiscal oversight by the department and accountability on the part of the Neighborhood Council's expenditures.
Thank you. And this agenda item was intended to address the issues of immediate concern that were raised by the controller's audit and to get initial feedback from the department on this. The Audits Committee will want to make a fuller exploration of some of the issues that were raised in the audit, but we do have our City Controller here with us today. So I'd like to ask, let me first offer you, Madam Controller, the opportunity if you'd like to present on this agenda item before we go to Mr. Kim.
Great, and thank you. And I had heard that you wanted to kind of focus on those that were immediate, and so I'll address my concerns based on those. And my auditors are here if you should have any questions. And appreciate you were present when we released the audit and your comments as well as Bongwan Kim's. As I've said many times, it's not always fun when you are the subject of an audit to stand next to the person who audited you as well, but I was impressed with some of the immediate actions that you were going to take to address some of the concerns. Just overall in the audit, what we found was that there really was a lack of oversight and training and that there were some immediate problems that needed to be fixed. One was the petty cash and the fact that there was not really, when the audit was done of the 89 and specifically of 12 of the neighborhood councils, particularly that we found that they couldn't always ascertain where the money was, as well as that there were a number of quarterly expenditure reports that were in the Dunn's office that needed to be reviewed as quickly as possible and potentially warrants going forward to the city controller for payment of bills. I think the other issue that was identified was the rollover funds and the fact, the potential for the $5.6 million difference. Mm-hmm. And I've heard in talking to a number of the neighborhood councils some of the challenges in essence, balancing the books between what the Dunn thinks they have and what the neighborhood councils think they have. Bong Wong and I had a chance to meet briefly yesterday again. We asked for some assistance in looking at those that had immediate concerns. We heard from some neighborhood councils that, for example, they wanted to access those rollover funds as quickly as possible because they had already purchased some equipment that was larger than the current budget has. And so we want to work cooperatively with your committee and with Bong Won Kim to make those immediate changes. There were a lot of other things that were in our audit that we outlined, but I think the most important thing is to ensure that neighborhood councils who have the appropriate documentation can get their bills paid as quickly as possible, that we can make sure that they also know where their purchases are and that Dunn has record of that. Dunn said that they wanted to work with us as well to make sure that we process some of those warrants that are outstanding. So we sit here ready to assist in some of those short-term actions that need to be taken place. But I heard from a number of the neighborhood councils when I went to the Valley Alliance about ensuring and meeting with some treasurers the importance of enforcement of some of the rules as well by Dunn. And so that kind of cooperation there is wide responsibility here at every level of how to improve that. So I just wanted to be here today. They said we're ready and willing to make some of those necessary changes as quickly as possible and to make a final presentation of the overall audit when appropriate.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Controller. And it should be noted that this was an audit that was actually requested by Mr. Kim and the department to try to find where there may be challenges in administration of these funds and where we might find improvements. And certainly the audit identified some areas that will need greater attention. And Mr. Kim, I'd like to ask you to address some of those and what the department has done initially, at least, to respond to those areas of concern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity to provide our department's response to the audit. And as you stated, I did request it. And with audits comes some risk. And the audit did rightly point out that our management, myself, had to be more on top of enforcing how neighborhood council funds were being spent. So I've made some management changes, and we are going to provide much more structure going forward and eliminating some key components of the funding program. But I thought if I could take a minute and provide you with a brief historical context for the funding program to kind of give us all a better sense of what we're looking at, because I walked into this situation and not without fully understanding the complexity of the mess that's been created with this funding program by the city family. So past general managers have prioritized payments over checks and balances and policy enforcement. There's no system of annual reconciliations between our department and neighborhood councils, between the controller and the CAO. There's no clear policy or system for tracking encumbered funds, quote unquote. The city has a way of encumbering funds. It doesn't apply to the neighborhood councils. This rollover policy that was established back in 05, 06 had different interpretations, and it was very easy to misunderstand how it's to be applied. So that impacts also the rollover balances. Bank of America was chosen as a purchase card vendor, and they weren't providing disaggregated data to our department on a timely basis. So a period of 3 years, there was about $3 million that Bank of America processed through purchase cards. We're going back and having to backtrack exactly where that money went. So past accounting practice internally have also created accounting nightmares. So we have to go back and manually track where that money went and how it went from our central account to individual neighborhood councils' accounts. We have data sets that don't talk to each other. We have our own internal tracking base, which was kind of put together with a lick and a promise by a management analyst. It doesn't sync with the city's financial management system. The prepaid purchase cards are a separate database. And so we have this inability to really reconcile overall. The rollover policy I mentioned has affected the rollover balance. In last fiscal year, the council withheld about $2.9 million from the funding program on the assumption that there was over appropriations. And that was partly due to the fact that we did not have an annual reconciliation process where we confirmed this is how much neighborhood councils have at the end of the year, and it's confirmed by us and the controller and the CAO. So there was this fuzzy rollover balance that was allowed to carry over, and that was the figure that we used to give to the CAO for the new appropriation. So that was what the discrepancy that was picked up in the audit, the difference between cash and appropriation. Then, most recently, the council passed ordinances for grants and donations, so allowing neighborhood councils to make grants to nonprofit organizations, which up until that ordinance was passed, they were not allowed to do, and also for donations, for neighborhood councils to accept donations. That's additional workload implications on our department without additional staff. So going forward, our staff was reduced by 40% over the past 2 years, and so a broken system is slowing down. And so now what we're looking at is re-engineering the entire system, which I think will be elaborated on in our formal response to the controller's audit at the end of February. But I did want to go into the immediate actions that our department will be taking with the caveat for those who are listening. This is not intended to penalize anybody, because I've heard that the transgressions of a few should not be applied broad stroke, and this is not about that. This is really about instilling a more consistent structure for the neighborhood council funding program that heretofore has not been in place. So the immediate actions that will be taken regarding the petty cash account, which will be discontinued as of February. This was, for your information, each neighborhood council was allowed to withdraw $500 in cash from their account to pay incidental expenses, out-of-pocket expenses when they organize community events. We're about 300 audits behind. Neighborhood councils are responsible for submitting quarterly audits, so we can't keep up with the audits. And it's very difficult to track. It's really hard to track on a real-time basis what's actually happening with the cash. It wasn't really enforced as a petty cash account. So mainly it's a staffing shortage issue that won't allow us to go forward with the petty cash. I understand that a lot of neighborhood councils will have difficulty because they're saying in order to organize all these events, we need to have the ability to pay petty cash, but it's simply not sustainable from a staff resource perspective. Secondly, we'll be requiring neighborhood councils to pass board resolutions authorizing separate duties for financial activities. For example, the treasurer should only be responsible for keeping the books. Another person should be responsible for paying the bills. Some neighborhood councils have treasurers that are doing both. There's a lot of risk and exposure there, as the audit properly found out. We'll be requiring the purchase card transactions to be included in financial reports that boards will have to approve a minimum of every other month, on the premise that the more eyes that are on the numbers, the fewer likelihood there is going to be of misuse of public funds. So that's another policy that will be. And some neighborhood councils already do that, but we're, again, no consistency there. Next, we'll be freezing funds for all neighborhood councils that have more than 4 outstanding audits. We're preparing letters, and currently 24 neighborhood councils are in that situation. Once they submit those audits, then they will have access to their funds. And then lastly, we're working on a formal response to the controller's audit. Some longer, more medium-range actions that the department will be taking. We've engaged with a work group of neighborhood council treasurers who've come forth and expressed interest in partnering with us, which I think is always important in major program improvements with the neighborhood council system, that we want the end users to be involved as much as possible. So we are looking at requiring all neighborhood councils to use a uniform financial reporting statement and an electronic template, so that something like an Excel spreadsheet that all neighborhood councils will be using will then report to us on a regular basis, and we'll be able to keep real-time data in terms of reconciliations. We'll be requiring all neighborhood councils to submit budget projections for the next fiscal year, and we'll be reviewing that and have an extensive process for giving them formal feedback on the budget and what's been approved and what hasn't been approved. The rollover balances are going to take some time, and to give you a background, basically the lack of reconciliation since the beginning of the funding program have left us uncertain about what exactly is the rollover balance. So currently, the policy that I instructed neighborhood councils to use their current allocation of $45,000 until we can complete the reconciliations of all 89 neighborhood councils. That takes a lot of time. But I'm told by my staff that we should be able to complete that accounting exercise around mid-March. After that, we will be issuing each neighborhood council a final determination of what their balance is. We'll develop an appeal process for those neighborhood councils who have financial records that would counter or contradict ours, and then develop a fair and open process that would also involve neighborhood councils in the appeals body, so that we're not being accused of trying to take anybody's budget allocation, but a fair and open process to get to that final reconciliation balance. We're also looking at fingerprinting for all neighborhood council treasurers. And we're also working with the controller and the CAO to come up with a more timely way of reconciling the financials that also sync with, in the city. The controller has been taking lead on revamping the entire city's financial management system, so we look forward to being able to use that program to track not just our central fund account, but how each neighborhood council sub-accounts work financially. And with that, I'll entertain any questions. There's a lot more I could talk about, but if you have any questions, I'll conclude there.
Mr. Design? Thank you. I want to compliment you, Madam Controller, for this fine audit. It troubles me that some of the discovery, neighborhood councils withdrew over $400,000 in cash advances, didn't comply with the policies, and some of the other frightening expenditures that didn't have the proper documentation. How many neighborhood councils were actually audited of the 89?
Well, all 89, we looked at whether or not they did split purchases or the $500. But there were 12, I'm looking back, right? 12, Farad? 12 that we did specifically where they went out and visited, met with their treasurers, looked to see, for example, their inventory, looked to see if they had their petty cash, some of those things. So they went to 12 in that instance.
So out of 89, 12, you discovered the problems that you're illustrated in this report. So if we would have done all 89, which I know would have been a time-consuming task, it might have been more horrifying than what we see here. Because some of these situations are really criminal in nature.
Well, as you know, there were 5 or 6 individuals that LAPD has been working with on certain neighborhood councils. The attachment 1 shows those that had cash advances greater than the 500 or on the split purchases. And I don't know, Farad, if you want to add anything else. This is, I don't know, Paul, if you've met our chief auditor, Farad, if there's any questions you have of him, if you want to answer, if there's anything I missed on that 12.
No, you did pretty good. Farad Safar with City Controller. The actual detailed transaction, we went out to 12 neighborhood councils. With regard to this split and use of petty cash, we look at all 89.
And what about the equipment, the items that were...
14 neighborhood councils we went in, including 3 that we went for the detailed transaction. So
Those were in addition to the 12, or was that included in the 12?
3 of them included in the 12.
Okay. And with some of these, I noticed where it says cash advance violation, split purchase, it has no notation. Does that mean that every single one was audited and there were no problems? Because a couple of those, I remember hearing, didn't turn in their documents. So does this mean that they were clean or they didn't turn in the documents? When you look at the...
I think you're talking about the attachment.
The attachment.
The attachment. Those are, I think for every one of them, we took it from what Dunn's information was that was presented there. So
every neighborhood council has finally complied with the requirement to submit the documents? Because I know there was some trouble getting those documents. I just want to see, because if it says, for example, Olympic Park, Northwest San Pedro, it shows no violations. Does that mean that they were fully in compliance on both sides, or they didn't have all the documents?
It means they didn't. There were no violations on the cash advance or the split purchases.
So each of the 89 were audited for that particular purpose?
Were reviewed for that purpose.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, because I noticed some of them had 100% compliance, others 50% compliance, others had multiple violations.
Right.
Because I look at this as taxpayers' money that is being misappropriated. If you misappropriate taxpayers' money, there's consequences for that. The other aspect is criminal implications. How many folks are currently under investigation by the DA, the city attorney, or the police department for inappropriate expenditures or theft or something in that arena?
6 individuals were brought forth to LAPD and the DA.
And how many neighborhood councils involved in the 6?
All 6 were serving as neighborhood council treasurers and/or president.
In 6 different?
6 different neighborhood councils, and in every case, it was the act of an individual. The board wasn't reviewing the financials on a regular basis, which is what allowed these individuals to get away with what they did.
And on the delinquency or any other activity that takes place, is it a practice from Dunn to notify the council member for that particular district? Or is that not the policy?
It is not a current practice.
See, I think we as council members would appreciate that information on our neighborhood council. If there's not compliance in one category or another, that we would be able to know for our benefit. I know Mr. Kokorian, I think, would benefit from that. I'd benefit from that. Because I look at the 6 that I have, and obviously I have meetings with them, the presidents, on a rotating basis. I just want to make sure, and I think my colleagues, whatever you find, since we do sometimes mutual projects, and there's expenditure, and there's city personnel, et cetera, that if there's something that's inappropriate, we want to know about it.
Right.
And Mr. Zine,
just keeps us on board with it.
On page 33 in Table 3, it does talk about the delinquent quarterly reports. This is one thing we've talked to done about, because some go back to 2006, that I think is indicated if they have not submitted the documentation for those quarterly reports, that in the future then they won't be able to access the next allocation of dollars.
Allocation. So cash is, excuse me, cash is going to be eliminated. It's going to be a credit card, and there's going to be documentation to track that through.
Correct.
Okay.
We had recommended as one option as an impressed fund, which was a little bit different than, which would mean you'd, in essence, you'd have $500 there, and you could take what you needed for amount, and then it kind of gets refilled up to that $500. That was a different, but I think Dunn has suggested getting away with it. Ours was looking just at an impressed fund. Because some neighborhood councils, again, not doing any wrong, but each month would take out their 500 petty cash because that's all they could have, and they'd hold it so they could use it for the next month. And if they happen to have, $600 or $700 worth of things they needed, then they'd have another $500. And it was really supposed to be used just access it only when you needed it.
And last year was $45,000 per neighborhood council?
Last year was 50,000.
No, this year.
Oh, this current year is 45,000.
This current year. And I know the budget's being submitted. I would speculate that this next budget, it may not be 45,000 based upon the economic situation of the city. So whatever the dollar value is, I think this is a very enlightening audit, which illustrates you need personnel to do what you need to do for checks and balance, and for the controller, for the review that was done, for the limited number that you found. We found some real frightening situations that were taking place in some of these neighborhood councils, and I commend you for that. But it's a scary situation when taxpayers' money is being misappropriated.
Well,
Thank
and
you,
if I may, on that point, and I think the controller pointed to some examples of where a neighborhood council might take a cash advance, hold it until the following month, violation of policy, but the idea being so that they would have money to spend for legitimate expenses in that following month. I just want to make clear that, the fact that there are identified cash advance violations or split purchase violations in this report, that does not suggest a misappropriation of taxpayer funds, does it? It suggests a policy violation, an accounting violation, which is a very different thing than misappropriation of taxpayer funds. Is that correct?
That is correct. And we spoke about at the press conference that not wanting to have a broad brush of that all neighborhood councils are at all misspending in that, but it is a policy. And one of the things on the $1,000, the cash, the split purchase, some of the neighborhood councils had shared with us, we included it in the audit, was that it took so long for them to potentially get a warrant out to pay that they felt they had no other option if they needed to do postage, for example, that was more than $1,000, knowing that it was a violation of policy, but trying to just do their job. And so I think there is a balance there, as you've indicated, Mr. Krikorian.
But I think Mr. Zine certainly in the audit certainly raises the very real concern that where there is an inadequate accountability structure, when there are inadequate accounting procedures in place, it opens the specter of the potential of misappropriation of funds, which is what we're all concerned about trying to prevent from happening, including, I'm certain, all or virtually all of the neighborhood council leadership as well, other than those 6 people perhaps that were previously mentioned. I don't want to comment about their intentions, but most people who are involved, I think, with neighborhood councils as well as the department, controller's office, and otherwise, want to make sure that we have systems in place so that the public can have confidence that the money is in fact appropriately being spent on legitimate neighborhood council needs.
I think it's my law enforcement nature. When you see one suspect, there's probably another one behind them. But I'll point to page 7, several neighborhood councils, and that's why I want to know how many were actually audited of the total 89 that we visited could not properly account for their cash. One neighborhood council could not account for at least 410. Another could not account for up to 6,000 in cash withdrawals, nor did it have expenditure receipts. Did we ever find out on the $6,000 what the story was?
No, they can account for it.
Pardon me?
They cannot account for it.
So there, somehow, somewhere, someplace, $6,000 is missing, not accounted for.
Yes.
See, to me, that's a major issue. And I'm not going to condemn anyone, but if you got $6,000 that's gone, That's a lot of, 410's that substantial amount, but 6,000 with no verification of where it went. Is that one of the indictments, the $6,000? Or maybe we
I
have one
don't
more.
think so.
Maybe we should have another one then. They're always looking for suspects. In the Jack Webb era of Dragnet.
Well, but, yeah, okay.
So, I mean, so what happens when you find $6,000 it's not accounted for? What do we do?
We're going to go deeper into that particular account and pursue the right answer. A lot of times, because they haven't been in the habit of keeping receipts, it may be more that they just haven't had a systematic way of maintaining the proper documentation.
But doesn't Dunn get some notification when they make a purchase?
Not with petty cash.
At $6,000?
Some neighborhood councils, not a lot, but some have basically accumulated the cash as another way to pay bills, which was completely in violation of the policies.
And how about on page 6, neighborhood councils have incurred $880,000 in purchases for which they have not submitted quarterly reports within the required time frames. Are we following up on that $880,000? I mean, the numbers keep getting higher. So what about the $180,000 in purchases?
Page 33 that I mentioned.
No, page 6.
I know, but it's referring to page 33 where we said those are the reports that have not been submitted. That is the total
of all of them.
Of all of those.
That's a lot of money. $880,000. So when it comes to $400 or $6,000, it all adds up, and then you're at $880,000. That's what I'm talking about, the honesty of the individuals and the fingerprinting. Are they going to do background checks on the treasurers?
We're doing the due diligence now with the city attorney in terms of what kind of background, the extent of background checks that we can have the council and city government approve.
I just think that when you're doing something for your neighborhood, you would do it, and the neighborhood would be assured that the people who are in charge of the money are doing it in the proper fashion. And when things go sideways, like you're the controller, if we put in a request for travel and we don't have receipts, you're going to send that back and say you're not getting the reimbursement.
That is correct.
Well, see, that's what I'm saying, and we have to comply. They have to comply if you don't have a receipt. But when you got $880,000, that's a whole lot of.
Well, the
purchases.
hope is that some of those may be in process. And again, I think what we are saying is that the system is broken as it's currently designed, and the department has been ill-equipped to be able to respond to that, and that there are, I think they're going to go to each of these neighborhood councils and find those reports. I think you indicated 24 have 4 quarters which they have not reported.
Correct.
And
That's
the
a year- that's a year's
sophistication,
worth.
and I think it is important to acknowledge the sophistication of some of the treasurers and others. Some are CPAs and kind of know exactly how to do it. Others I've spoken to said, we just did it how we knew. We didn't have the proper training, and it may not be that they did anything illegal or improper, but didn't have the kind of information or support they needed to be able to provide it to the department.
Then maybe they shouldn't be the treasurer.
Yeah, well, and in some neighborhoods, there may not be a lot of choices, but I guess, that leads to the obvious question for Dunn, which is that given the fact that you've had a 40% reduction in your staff over the last 2 years, what is the department able to do in terms of training for neighborhood council, instruction on appropriate procedures, making sure that they're aware not just of the rules of the road right now, but also the new policies that you're going to be immediately implementing in response to this audit? What are you doing in order to get the word out to neighborhood councils and to ensure that they have the tools to comply?
Well, I fully plan on utilizing the attention that's been generated by this audit by the public to say that it's a new day. And I've instructed my staff that this is an all-hands-on-deck project where we're looking at redesigning the system, doing the rollover balance reconciliations, and we're also going out to communicate directly and collect the information, like the separation of duties of the treasurers. That's immediate. I want every board to take that action within the next 2 months to tell us that the people who are keeping the books and people who are paying the bills are 2 entirely different people. and that the board is reviewing the financials.
And how are those immediate changes being communicated to the now 90 neighborhood councils?
I'm preparing a e-blast that will go out, and then our field staff will follow up with the message. On the training piece, that is probably one of the biggest weaknesses of the neighborhood councils, because the skill level of the treasurers is highly variable. So a lot of neighborhood council treasurers who are retired and who've been CPAs have come forth and said they would like to volunteer serving as mentors. So one of the projects I'd like to have them work on is a training manual for all the neighborhood councils that we could use on our website, put on our website. And then secondly, they would volunteer to serve as advisors and coaches to all the neighborhood councils who request that kind of assistance. So I think if we can rely on the volunteer person power with the neighborhood councils, I think that's going to allow us to make a lot of progress in terms of addressing the uneven skill sets that are out there. Because managing public funds is an arduous task. So the challenge for me is to create a system that is as user-friendly to a volunteer-driven system and yet meets the control needs of the checks and balances needs of the cities. That's a huge challenge. That kind of financial management system doesn't exist anywhere in the city.
Is it possible for a neighborhood, or could it be possible for a neighborhood council to have a treasurer who is not actually a member of that neighborhood council board? So that, for example, if you've talked about having people, accountants who are mentoring other treasurers, I wonder if there might be some consolidation so that a treasurer might be able to serve more than one neighborhood council, so that the limited number of people with the appropriate skill set might be able to be more fully applied. But I see that the answer to that is no.
That's not the way it's set up. Of course, changes can be made, but...
Just to respond, I think one of the options that some neighborhood councils who didn't believe they had the skill set used a portion of their money to hire someone from an Apple One or another location, another entity to help them through that process. We've talked about as well helping them, using a Quicken or some other kind of system that everyone can kind of agree to, that would easily be able to, even without a much knowledge base, be able to use those systems to try to work with them to do that.
Yes, the neighborhood councils are allowed to use vendors that have accountants and bookkeepers. So that would be something that if neighborhood councils were struggling, we would either strongly recommend in the beginning, and if they continue to struggle, we'd probably require it.
All right. Mr. Zine, anything further?
No.
What I'd like to do is, I understood, if I understood correctly, Mr. Kim, you said that your full response to the audit would be prepared sometime in late February.
Correct.
All right. Then what I'd like to suggest is that we come back in the first meeting in March for a more detailed discussion of the progress that you've made and the responses that you have to the audit, if we might.
I would welcome that.
All right, thank you. We do have some public comment on this item, though, so thank you, Madam Controller. Thank you, Mr. Kim. The first speaker I have on item number 2 is Noel Weiss. Mr. Weiss.
Thank you. I have serious problems with the audit. I think it's an embarrassment. I think it's disgraceful. I think it's inept, and I think it's incompetent. You review this. I think it's a political document, and those and Mr. Zine's questions kind of went in that direction. Those who want to basically cut down the dollars going to the neighborhood councils can easily cite aspects of this report. The purpose of the report was not to audit the neighborhood councils. Ms. Gruhl had an opportunity after the report to talk to neighborhood council representatives of the Valley Alliance. That's the kind of information that should have been incorporated into the report. You got into it a little bit here today. Hire a bookkeeper. Not a hard solution. Standard accounting programs. Checkbooks, where people are accountable when their signature's on the bottom line. Put everything online. There's no reason why in this day and age we can't have this financial documentation online to facilitate the kind of thing that we're talking about. People don't want to have it. So, I mean, in terms of these controls, I don't want council members to use this report, which was supposed to be done, not of the neighborhood councils, to start racking the neighborhood councils. Nobody condones what they did, but it's not a fair report. Anybody reading this report, you'd have to say, where did the $5.6 million go? Do we know? That's the point of the report. She doesn't tell us. Wendy Gould, if you read the report, do you know what Dunn does if you're not familiar with the city systems? Do you know how many people Dunn has? Do you know if there are any accountants on Dunn's staff? Do you know if there are any accountants on the controller's staff? We don't know any of that. Those are critical information. That's critical information. Ms. Gruhl should withdraw the report or amend the report at a minimum to basically incorporate some of the problems and the difficulties that she learned subsequent to issuing the report. If she is unwilling to do that, I think, bottom line, with all due respect to the controller, this is not a competent report. It's a political document, and it should not be used in any way, shape, or form to basically undermine the dollars that the neighborhood councils should and become entitled to. And in my public comment, I'll describe some other ways that I think the neighborhood councils can do better with regard to some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. The next speaker is Barbara Monahan Burke. Ms. Burke, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Barbara Monahan Burke with the Studio City Neighborhood Council. I'm a board member and also Government Affairs co-chair. I have read and discussed the audit that was requested by Dunn. I had understood that this would be a financial audit, but to me it's also a performance audit. As presented, it is highly controversial, detrimental to Dunn and all neighborhood councils, even when not deserved. I know our Studio City Neighborhood Councils has repeatedly been told that our financial work is exemplary, and yet I'm listening here, seeing everybody dealt this broad brush, and I with the exception of what you just were talking about, Councilman Krikorian. So this is a huge problem for neighborhood councils. I personally enjoy working with Banwan Kim, and I think he's trying to do the best he can within a limited department, and I do want to put that in personally. My main problem is the repetition throughout of the proposed need. I don't have it in front of me. By the audit staff, which is signed by City Controller Wendy Gruhl, to have the City Council, and I believe even the Mayor, review and probably change the goals, powers of the neighborhood councils to align with the goals of the financial allowances. In the city charter, the powers of the neighborhood councils are to be advisory to the City Council committees, to the boards, commissions, the mayor, the city departments. In addition to that, we are allowed to hold public hearings prior to City Council making a decision on matters of local concern so we can get the community's input. An example, the neighborhood councils cite this broadly as advising of concerns of our community to city, council, state, and even federal governments. When you read the charter that way, it is broad and not narrow. And yet in this document, I don't have time to finish everything, but I do want to finish with this. In this document, I see that it is a policy being set forth to limit us even more. And there are people who do not support neighborhood councils within the city, and I think put out the way it has been, it is really detrimental. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final speaker I have on this item is John Blue. Mr. Blue, welcome.
John Blue representing himself, but speaking, I think, as on the whole for all the neighborhood councils. My buddy Noel said about everything I said. I would have said, and better. I would say that if this laser-like attention to detail and accountability was applied to the city as a whole, we wouldn't be $400 million in debt. Why don't we turn it on its head? Instead of underfunding Dunn 40%, maybe that was the cause of the undereducation of the NCs. If we fully fund Dunn, we may not have this problem. If Dunn was considered and the neighborhood councils were considered as a major asset to the city, this wouldn't happen. Thirdly, we're 10 years into the NC experiment. The city of LA for the first 100 years we made movies of the clown-like things that went on in this city. Chinatown, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a new leg of the city. These are the people that are the most frequently and intimately interfaced with the people as a whole, not our council representative, with the surprising exception of Mr. Krikorian, who appears everywhere in our neighborhood. These people are the ones that are the true spokesperson. If they err, they err. If they try their best, they try their best. If there's snakes in the grass, there's going to be snakes in the grass. This city is a city of 8 million people. Not everyone is going to be an angel. This city council did not have angels for the greater part of its early years. You have to remember this is the baby steps of an organization that is the major interface of the city. They are going to make mistakes, and these mistakes are not horrors. They are not this is, they are not that. They will be caught, they will be punished, they will be brought to account. But my big fear is this audit will, as everyone else said, be a whitewash, a pin in, a nail in the coffin of attempts to put this neighborhood council down, and I would urge this board to moderate the title of the report and view it as one facet of the ongoing growth of neighborhood councils.
Thank you, Mr. Blue. There's no action required on item number 2. We're going to be bringing it back for further discussion as soon as the full response is due in the first meeting in March. So that brings us then to general public comment.
Chairman Krikorian, if I may, could we just go to item 1 for a minute for a point of clarification? Sure. In the recommendation that you adopted, there is a recommendation to have a letter agreement between the city clerk and an interim board of the Westwood Neighborhood Council. They don't have an interim board, but they could certainly pick one by pulling names out of a hat or whatever. The reason that they need that letter agreement is, they need a letter agreement. If you're going to have a letter agreement, you have to have an entity or a board in which to have that agreement with. And so, and they don't have one now. So if the recommendation is that they have some sort of a letter agreement with the city clerk or the city, if you will, that they select a group of people to sign that agreement or to interface with them. And it could be whatever, a quorum of what their original board would be, the number.
How would we determine what their initial board would be?
Well, they have their bylaws, and let's say it's 21, a quorum would be 11, you would need, or, so they would need at least 11.
Bangwan Kim, Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. The way I would approach this is a unique situation. Typically, after we certify a neighborhood council, the signatories compose the interim body that oversees the seating of the board members. So I would suggest that what the commission's action were to select 2 people from the formation committee, 2 people from the homeowners association, and 1 person to be assigned by Dunn. Those 5 people would make the decisions. In this case, it would be those 5 people that would sign the agreement with the city clerk to conduct the elections.
It's fine.
Yes.
Leila Campos, Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. Can't help but wonder if such process would not in fact be in violation of the bylaws. As the bylaws say, that in the event that city clerk does not administer the election, then there will be a selection process.
Well, we originally opined that they need some sort of a process despite, the bylaws. So I don't think they would be in violation of their bylaws by simply selecting an interim board to interface with the city is what we're talking about. And that has been an important point in the past because interim board members sort of have the inside track on dealing with the city in upcoming elections. So you want it to be a fair process.
Yeah, in the role for current purposes would be limited simply to agreeing that the clerk will administer the election without further customization, basically. Right. So I think it's an exceptionally limited role that these interim board representatives would have. Mm-hmm. I think Mr. Kim's suggestion of the 5-person panel is more than sufficient to meet that need. So if that can be our understanding, I don't know if it requires an amendment to the motion, but that would be.
No, I think we can call it a clarification.
Okay. That's fine. All right. So that's without objection, we would clarify our action that way. So that brings us, thank you very much. That brings us to general public comment. Mr. Weiss.
Thank you. Before you, well, Darrell will hand to you. There's a California progress report dated yesterday. Foundations are quitting California. Mr. Krikorian is in the right place at the right time as far as the city's history, given the fact that we have issues with neighborhoods and we have issues with educational policy. The prior chairman of this committee, chairperson of this committee, I think failed the city and failed the people in not basically following through on some of these important facts and characteristics. Specifically, last night, East Hollywood Neighborhood Council, they're leveraging some of their money. And I could make an argument why, Mr. Zine, you should give them more money. Because they, for example, they're applying for grants now. In East Hollywood Neighborhood Council, they're going to apply for a grant through the state, and they're going to match, and we're probably another maybe 4,000 or 5,000 could be translated into 20,000. And it's basically a study on bicycle safety and how they can train the community and the bike and the cyclists to do a better job. Downtown Neighborhood Council leveraged, I think, 5,000 into 15 or 20,000 with a green study through the AIA, the Association of Institute of Architects. So going forward, there are other issues in the city. Primarily, my major concern right now, I think, is confronting the issue of the mayor's power over to run the schools. This is a very important issue. It was an issue that I brought up before. Mr. Alarcon did nothing with it. I respectfully ask that it become an item of consideration because, frankly, it interfaces and overlaps a number of critical areas here. I don't think the mayor's got the power to do what he's doing. It's not to say that he shouldn't be doing it, but I think we got to get the right result for the right reason in the right way. He doesn't have the power and the authority to do it under the charter, and he screws up and he exposes the city to huge liability in a budget problem and a budget crisis. The dollars that Mr. Zine talked about for the neighborhood councils are pennies in comparison to the potential exposure that the city has. We need to get into these issues. We need to audit the mayor. If the controller wants to do something significant, let her audit the mayor. Yeah, but nevertheless, anyway, these are a couple of issues going forward that hopefully we'll begin to discuss, and I think you can make a huge difference, and I look forward to that happening.
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. And if there's no other general comment, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much.